Hello, and welcome to the Arizona Civics Podcast. In this podcast, we will share our journey of sustaining Arizona's interest in reforms to civics by collaborating with civic educators in our state and nationwide. This important work is being spearheaded by the Center for American Civics at Arizona State University. I'm Liz Evans, Civic Education Program Director at ASU, and your host for this podcast. I will interview teachers, content experts, and civic education leaders throughout our episodes, providing valuable insights and perspectives. We hope you enjoy joining us on this journey to make Arizona a national civics model. Okay, and then we're just going to go ahead and get started because the best part about this, listeners, is that this is going to be made into a podcast. So if you missed the first part of it, or if you want to go back, this is something that you get to do. The podcast that we'll talk about that kind of at the end, but we'd like to welcome everybody. This webinar is called Less Stress, More Learning, Simple Ways to Discuss Policy and Politics in Your Classroom. It is day 3 of Civic Learning Week, and I'm so excited to be here with my partners. I'm going to introduce myself. I am Liz Evans. I am one of the Civic Education Program Directors at Arizona State University's Center for American Civics. With me today, I have James Cohen from More Like Us and Dr. Bill Bianco from Policy versus Politics. And then we have the wonderful Corinne, who is going to be helping me in this. But we're going to go ahead and get started. So James Cohen is the Executive Director at More Like Us, and Dr. Bill Bianco is a Research Director at Policy versus Politics. These are my panel today. I'm going to invite them to introduce themselves and the work at their respective organizations. So James, I'll have you start.
Okay, thanks, Liz. It's great to be here, and thanks for everyone who's attending or listening to the podcast later on. So I'm James Cohen. I'm the Executive Director of More Like Us. More Like Us tries to reduce political polarization. We focus on closing what's often called the perception gap, the finding that Americans are actually more similar to each other than they think across the political spectrum. And we're starting in secondary education. So I'll talk more about it, but we have a lesson plan, and there'll be a couple other resources that will be available in the next few months.
Thank you. And then Dr. Bill Bianco from Policy versus Politics. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm the research director for Policy versus Politics, and what we are is an organization whose mission is to help average citizens, ranging from high school students to senior citizens, to make sense of policy questions, to learn about the options that are out there, what the problems are, and to decide what they think. Now, I should also add that in my day job, I'm a professor of political science at Indiana University, Bloomington, and I've taught Intro to American Government for over 30 years. I also have a textbook on American government that's used in both university and high school classes. So the issues that you're talking about here are of deep concern to me and deep interest to me. I'm teaching Intro American Government this semester, so it is a very real-time concern for me.
And this is, I feel like a timely and an evergreen conversation when we're talking about having conversations about policy and about politics in a classroom, but we're also in an election year this year. So there's just a lot to talk about. We do invite attendees. If you have a question, please put it in there. We definitely made sure that we have room for those questions. So we'll just kind of jump into the first question. So why is discussing policy, politics, and perception gaps in the classroom essential? So really kind of that high school and college age. And Bill, I'll go ahead and start with you.
Well, thanks. The way I frame the intro class, understanding that conflict is endemic to politics, a natural part of politics, is just exceedingly fundamental. It's the first thing that I talk about in the class. James Madison said over 250 years ago that the urge to differ is universal, that people are going to arrive at the political process with different ideas about what they want to do. And we must acknowledge that that is politics, that politics is not easy. Politics is a contest. The consequences matter. And there are very, very rarely solutions that everyone likes. And I understand that raises the fact that what we do in the classroom is a very sensitive issue. People care about what students learn, and rightly so. And the way I pitch it is that we might be able to agree not on what students decide, not on what students think, but on it being an informed choice. That students, like everybody else, need to have the information they need to make a decision. And I'll also put the opposite, that if we don't talk about about policy in civics classes, in American government classes, then we are overlooking what politics is about. Politics is about deciding what government does. And I don't know how we would be able to teach one without the other.
Thank you for that, James.
Yeah, great. So yeah, I'll build off what Bill's saying. An informed choice, and being aware of the political environment. So I'll focus on the perception gap. And so this finding that we're more similar than we tend to think across the political spectrum. And I think that this often can facilitate conversations in the classroom about policy, or policy in particular, sometimes politics. I mean, I think to a lot of people this is imposing or intimidating to have this, especially in an environment like this. And the hope is that by focusing on perception gap at the beginning, right, maybe it's just a single class period. It doesn't have to belabor the point that the people on the other side, quote unquote, right, are not as different as we think. They're not as threatening, right? They're not as scary. And so whether they're in the classroom or whether they'll just be discussed in the classroom, then okay, hopefully this reduces anxiety about having conversations. And also the perception gap tends to show that there's a lot of positions between the poles. We might hear a lot about the poles, news media, social media, a lot of incentives encourage people to say the most extreme things, and students often get this on TikTok or wherever. But we actually poll Americans, there are perspectives all along the spectrum. There are a lot of nuances, details of policies, but just a lot of positions kind of along a continuum rather than just two binary choices.
So, James, can I have you kind of define what perception gap is, especially as it relates to your work? And that way, if somebody is listening and they're like, I've actually never heard this term, what is a perception gap?
Yeah, so a perception gap, and there are varieties of it, but it's really in this case, we're talking about politics. I mean, there could be perception gaps about other topics as well, but just in this political context, just a misperception about people in the other party, or about people in general along the political spectrum. And what researchers consistently find is that Americans overestimate these differences. So I think about the perception gap as head, heart, and driver's license. Right. So we'll probably be talking mostly about head. So misperceptions about policy topics. And usually it's kind of directly, just kind of misperceiving that we just think that they're all the same and they're all extreme. It can also be a meta perception, what we think they think of us, all in this kind of broad category of misperceptions. And there's a lot of work that can talk about why this matters, right? It's not just ooh, this is kind of intriguing. It would be nice to fix this kind of oddity that people have. No, this is actually very problematic, but it's also been shown that it's addressable, at least among adults. But there aren't really organizations that are trying to push these research results into the public. Be far more like us.
So can I ask, and I don't know, I mean, you kind of answered this, James, but why is it important to address it? So one of the things I'm thinking of is recently the State of the Union, right? State of the Union is on TV. And regardless of the party of the president, you often notice who is standing, and clapping, who is not. In recent State of the Unions, there's been just outward heckling. So why is it important for us as educators to acknowledge the perception gap exists at all?
Yeah, so a few things here. I mean, one, so elected officials do not necessarily reflect the will of the population as a whole. Elected officials do tend to have more kind of down the line views, right? More kind of aligned with, say, a party platform. Whereas Americans as a whole, even if they're voting for different leaders, don't tend to be as extreme. Also, there's an incentive in news media, kind of a double whammy, to highlight the most extreme members of each party. So, right, there are 435 members of the House. How many people who even are really devoted followers of the House can name many members, right? Okay, maybe you can name Marjorie Taylor Greene and AOC, but one who's saying that is identifying the most extreme members, and even that is not the same set of people as the general population. In terms of why this matters as a whole and why I'm in this, so I'm concerned about what is often called political polarization, but many people, or I think it's sometimes more accurate to say fear and loathing of the other side, a sense that they're so threatening and that they're so inferior that they shouldn't have power. And if there's this sense that they shouldn't have power at all costs, that can lead to breakdowns of democratic republics and or political violence. And so that really is what drives me. The research tends to show that this is a real risk. And again, it can be addressed, at least to some extent, by just having more accurate perceptions of who they are. And they're not as different and scary.
Bill, how does that work, when we're looking at kind of policy, acknowledging that perception gap exists?
Well, let me think of this from the viewpoint of a classroom teacher. I mean, identifying that there's a gap, whether it's perceptions about policy or perceptions about the other side, is just a great teachable moment. That there's something students need to learn. When recently I was talking about the foreign aid budget, and the sort of polls center on foreign aid being something like 30% of the budget. That's the average people give you when you ask them, and it's more like 0.5%. And that just there sort of snaps your neck back. But it's bigger than that. That if we do talk about the perception gap, we can start identifying points of agreement and disagreement. We can see that it's not 100%. It's not black. Policy choices are not black and white. We're de-stereotyping the opposition. We're de-stereotyping the other side. I mean, one thing that I am very conscious of teaching, in a largely rural, bright red Midwestern state, that it's a big wide world out there, and not that many of my students understand that. They just haven't traveled, and to begin to talk about the others as human beings with their own ideas is a very significant step. It's hard to hate people that you have some sense of. But two deeper things. It also brings us closer to explaining to students what research is about. Like, what are we doing when we do research? Well, we're finding things out about the world, like measuring public opinion and comparing public opinion on two sides. And finally, and this is something I push very hard in my class, is it distinguishes what we want from what is. That in a sense, the natural thing when you talk about policy is to talk about what do you want? What kind of policy conception would you like to see? But I think it's really important to start with the facts on the ground. What is, and whether our perceptions actually match to that reality.
This is just so exciting. It's funny that you talk about, Midwestern red state. I'm in Arizona, which is purpley. It's definitely kind of changed. So it's humanizing, them, right? I think that's what I'm getting from both of you is we always say, well, they think, well, they are humans. They have ideas. And like you said, Bill, it's not black and white. And I think that sometimes, media, whether it's the news or if our students are getting information from TikTok or X, formerly known as Twitter, they're seeing it a little more. So this leads me to my next question.
One point I just want to say to close the loop. Let me not disparage my fellow Hoosiers. I've taught for I've taught at 2 other universities for long periods of time, and this has nothing to do with red or blue or Midwest or anything like that. My students are between 18 and 22 years old. It is a very rare undergraduate who has a broad sense of the world. They have not lived enough, experienced enough, been to enough places. I always tell them, when you graduate, take 3 weeks and drive cross country. You'll be amazed at how wide the country is and how different places are. And that's part of what we contend with in the classroom.
So speaking of the classroom, so I taught for 17 years, and I taught during the 2016 election, 2020. And one of the things as a teacher that I had happen is students always come in, they see something on the news and they'd come in and they're asking questions based on what they've seen or heard in the media. So what advice do you have for teachers navigating these questions, especially when we talk about current events? If we're talking about, two that come to mind are immigration and reproductive rights, which I know some teachers are like, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole, but you have kids who are coming in and they have questions. What advice would you have for teachers? Bill, I'm going to go ahead and start with you.
Well, it's interesting. This issue comes up in my class, in the intro class. Immigration is going to be a big issue in the election. At Policy versus Politics, we just completed a group of half a dozen briefs about immigration, everything from refugees and asylum to authorized immigration to border security and whether terrorists are sneaking through the checkpoints. And I think the way I would talk about it, the way we talked about it in the briefs and the way I talk about it in my class, really paraphrases Daniel Patrick Moynihan, that everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own data. That the discussion starts or should start with a sense of what we know about the issue. In the case of immigration, where are people coming from? Why are they coming here? How many of them? And what happens to them once they get into the country? And you begin to find out things like the people who are crossing the border now are very, very different than what was happening a decade ago or 2 decades ago, when people were coming for short periods of time, primarily for economic motivations, and they had no intention of staying. Whereas now what you're seeing are people fleeing desperate situations, political turmoil with families. And part of the problem or part of the immigration issue is that there's simply a lot of them. And if you begin to accept all that, you begin to understand why things are such a mess at the southern border, and why there are no good choices. That this is not a problem where you can simply pull on one string, and that's a big deal. I think in the classroom, a lot of students sort of begin with the idea that there's like one neat trick that could solve just about anything, and those issues don't rise to the national government level. They get taken care of earlier than that. And so that gives students a better basis to decide what they think and to also find points of commonality with the other side. For example, I think, regardless of what we feel about refugee admissions or the number of people who should be allowed into the country every year, most people, I think, when they read this stuff, they say, wow, those southern towns along the Texas border, along the Arizona border, they're really suffering. That no matter what we do, maybe that's something we could take care of first. There are, within the great many opinions one could hold about immigration, there are some points of common interest. I think that these are tricky issues. I think there's an instinct to speak from your heart, to explain to students how you decided what you decide, what you decided. And that's part of what we do in the classroom. We teach students how to decide. It's sort of a broad-based goal that we have. I think that's in my experience, that's not a place I want to go. If I have opinions just like everybody else, but my opinions are no better than anybody else's. And by talking about that, I give up what I see as my edge in the classroom, which is here's some data, let's see what it means. And so these are hard questions. I think that's a way of lowering the temperature in the classroom.
So it's great. Liz, I will get to your question. First, I want to address something that came up before. So humanizing the other side. Broadly, I think that's right. But it's a little general. It's a little unclear. What does that mean? They also live in houses. They also eat. Like what how do you want to prove? And there's some pretty bad people, in history. So just saying that they're human may or may not, be very convincing. So one thing that will be a resource in probably the next month or two, maybe will be a resource if you're listening to this later, is a mnemonic that I've developed. It's called CAST, Casting the Other Side in a Better Light, CAST. And so that stands for complexity, admiration, similarity, and togetherness. So showing the other side as more complex. There's a bunch of unique individuals. And in this large mass of tens of millions of Democrats or Republicans, right, there's all sorts of subgroups and interest groups, and right, it's not an undifferentiated stereotypical mass. And then admiration, there's often this sense that the other side, they're somehow inferior, intellectually, cognitively, morally. But many people do things that are worthy of respect or admiration. Doing selfless acts, working really hard, and highlighting those stories more. And then, I've covered similarity, but as you can see, perception gap and similarity is just one part of this way to fear and loathe the other side less. And then finally, togetherness, the potential to collaborate with and or be friends with those on the other side. And those kinds of stories, I think, can be quite powerful. And that gets into mixing, say, art and social studies, which in some ways is what we're doing right now, right? This is communications media and a podcast. So we're mixing some kind of maybe ELA type thing with social studies, as we're speaking. Now to the question that you're asking. I mean, just like Bill said, I'd focus on these kind of data points. The data points that I tend to focus on are less. I think they both need to be addressed. But what More Like Us focuses on is not necessarily data points and just how many immigrants are coming and what is the socioeconomic status of these immigrants and all these kind of questions about the background. But what do we think they and the other political party think about this topic? And there could be this perception again that there is a Republican position and a Democratic position, and there's like little to no overlap. And on both of the topics that you brought up, Liz, immigration and reproductive rights, there is, at least when surveying the general public, there's quite a bit of overlap. I mean, yes, the kernel of the stereotype is correct. When it comes to immigration, Republicans are more concerned than Democrats, right? When it comes to reproductive rights, Republicans are more likely to be quote unquote pro-life than pro-choice. But then when you dig deeper, it's not as black and white. So with immigration, we actually do have pretty clear data of a perception gap. Back in 2019, there was a group called Beyond Conflict that asked people, and I've actually played games with people like this. We could play a game. I guess I'll just explain it here. But imagine a number line: 0 completely open borders, 100 completely closed borders, no immigrants, and 0 would be essentially no immigration controls whatsoever. Maybe no even border checks. And when people actually answer that for themselves, the average Democratic answer was about 35. The average Republican answer was 75, with some overlap. When people were asked about the other side, the average answers were less than 10 and more than 90. And so you see this visual, it's shocking because it looks like it looks like a valley when really it's like a mountain range, all across this spectrum. And then there's all sorts of policy topics, just how many immigrants, what is the background of the immigrants who will come, legal versus undocumented, right? All these details rather than all or nothing. And when it comes to pro-life and pro-choice, it's somewhat similar. We don't have clear answers about the perception gap, but I think it will surprise people, some of the results. So Pew in 2022 and for 15 years before that has done a lot of work on perceptions in the American public on abortion topics. They divide it into 4 categories. It should be legal all the time, most of the time, rarely or never. And really the answers are 30, 30, 30, 10. So you get about 60 who you might call pro-choice, 60%, 40% you might consider more pro-life. And when we get into the actual, politics, so, now roughly 80% of Democratic leaders would be in this kind of pro-choice or usually abortion kind of category. But about 40% of Republicans are also in this like pro-choice kind of category. And that has been stable for the 15 years that they've looked at this. So, right, it is not this, right, one or the other. And I think in the classroom, it can be a nice way to start by saying, okay, right, I mean, there's this contentious policy topic, but when you actually look at the American public, sure, there are differences, right? The name of my organization is More Like Us, not just like us or same as us or anything like that, right? There are differences, but they're not as stark as many people tend to think.
I love that. I'm just nodding in my head. We do have a question from Amanda Wright. And Amanda's asking, how can teachers address the issue of, people are like, but what about what the other side did when trying to discuss actions of the government? She said that having discussions can often turn into almost a tennis match. So, Bill, I'll start kind of with you. How would you address that?
Well, first of all, I think James is really onto something with that CAST acronym and what it means. I would, the way I think of I think where he's going is this idea of know why people think what they think. If people are, there's a sizable fraction of people who are against large, high immigration quotas because they work or own businesses that are extremely vulnerable to high levels of immigration, construction, service industries, and that's a big deal that is sometimes overlooked. That we just say, well, people are against abortion; they're just viscerally nativist. For some people, it's economic, and if you put yourself in their position, then you could understand why they feel that way. It also gives you something to do. I mean, in terms of policy, it gives the government something to do. We can start thinking about how we might mitigate that problem, or at least acknowledge that immigration is not an unbridled benefit to everyone in the country, at least not in direct economic terms. That it may make, you can talk about the great melting pot, and there is value to that, but there are some people who are paying the price for that. I think that how do we talk about what the other side did? Well, we start understanding why does the other side think what is the situation that they see, and that goes back to perception gaps. That there's something more than if you want to understand the context to make policy, you have to have some sense of where the other side is coming from, and to have that conversation without saying which side is better. Now, I also agree with something James said, that there are some truly bad people out there. I'm not making an argument that in the classroom any position is okay. There are some things that we would that are sort of not on my acceptable list. But I think most of the time those aren't what we're talking about. We're talking about what programs government should fund, or who should pay taxes and how much. And these are questions on which people of goodwill could disagree. We could reason to different conclusions, and that would be perhaps regrettable if more people are on the other side of an issue than me, but not terribly surprising.
James?
So yeah, okay, the tennis match question. So okay, here's one possible way to approach it. I think incentives matter greatly, and our current political environment has a lot of perverse incentives. And so, what are the incentives for news media and social media? It's to get as much attention as possible. To get attention, make emotionally arousing content. What is more emotionally arousing? Politically polarizing content, right? Like, we can have a webinar and be like, it's good to have reasoned, calm conversations with each other, and it will get like very few views, right? I mean, it just doesn't cause people's blood to boil and doesn't keep people engaged necessarily all that much. So when people are doing things, right? I mean, if we're watching a Senate hearing, for instance, right? Really, this is performative in many cases to get really good clips to put on social media to raise money. Or now we get into, say, like, what are the incentives for politicians? Is more in the House. If you have a closed primary and a gerrymandered district, typically the concern for an elected official that generally wants to get reelected is to prevent a primary challenge from either their right if they're a Republican or from their left if they're a Democrat. So their behavior and rhetoric will tend to try to prevent this potential primary challenge. And so I'd often ask, why are people doing this? In some cases, it might be like this person is just kind of unusual, but in many cases, it's like, well, this actually makes sense. They are behaving in a fairly reasonable way given the incentives that they're facing.
I mean, I love that because it almost turns that on its head, right? As if, well, the Democrats did this or the Republicans did this, framing it as, well, I wonder why, right? Is there an election coming up? Especially on TikTok, because that's where all the kids are, is this something that's easily circulating and getting these views? I really love those. And Amanda, I hope that really kind of answers your question. I do have another
You,
question. Oh, go ahead, Bill.
I'd also say, you know, in 1990, when I was a very young assistant professor, I interviewed a member of Congress, a Chicago machine politician, and I walked into his office and sat down with him, and he looked up at me and he said, "Okay, first I got to understand how you're going to use what I tell you, because I'm going to give you political answers, or I can tell you the truth." And social media sharpens that problem, but the sort of going back to this era of good feeling in politics. I mean, I don't know, not in any of our lifetimes, right? I mean, politics has always been a brutal business. In the 60s, there were all the protests around the war and civil rights and the environment. In the 70s, protests around rearmament and the Cold War and reindustrialization. 90s, what are we going to do that the Cold War is over? Like, there's never been a moment where we've all held hands and said kumbaya. um, it, Social media, I think James has got it right. Social media makes it worse. But this idea that somehow it's changed us, changed the underlying urge to differ. I don't know, marginally maybe, but not really. The fact is, America has never been united. In my last lecture, I say, well, maybe that's our strength, that we somehow can manage a society where we disagree and not wind up shooting each other. Well, in fact, we did, but not often anyway.
So I do have another question. So we are in a presidential election year, and it feels like, so my perception is it feels like during presidential like election years, this is where we see the media, whether it's social media, news media, really trying to exacerbate this divide, right? Especially as we're coming up on, presidential primaries, just it is that time. How can teachers in communities that tend to be more homogeneous have conversations that address perception gaps, address policies? Because a lot of teachers teach in very mixed communities, politically mixed communities, which is great. But what about those teachers who maybe there's this large majority of one party and a smaller majority of the other? um how can they kind of address perception gaps, policies, without othering any of their students? Is that question? I feel like that makes sense. I'm rambled a little bit. James, do you mind if I start with you?
Yeah, no, I mean, good, very good question. I mean, the nice thing about talking about perception gaps is that it does not require, right? Like it per the information about perception gaps can be given to a homogeneous audience, right? It doesn't require, say, conversations across a divide, which would necessitate, some people who have one set of beliefs and one of another, or some people who just, kind of play the, pretend that they have beliefs for a while. And perception gaps are remarkably symmetrical. I mean, there are small differences. I mean, from dealing with this for a while, I can point out little differences, but by and large, they are like mirror images of one another. So Democrats tend to be just as diluted as Republicans. I mean, there are sometimes small things like there could be an effect with educational attainment, and Democrats are actually the most educated Democrats may have the largest perception gaps. Those who follow the news the most may have the largest perception gaps. It's kind of ironic, these findings from the original perception gap study that a group called More in Common did in 2019. But it also shows that, I don't know who's on the call or who will be listening, but if you have like an AP Gov class, like this is actually really important to, talk about, with students who might be going to, very competitive colleges later on, or in colleges, that right, some of the, people who will be in the most influential positions arguably have some of the largest perception gaps. And so, we can often talk about, and rightly so, a lot of communities that have had disadvantages, but in this case, sometimes the most advantaged communities are most susceptible to this kind of thing, or suggestive that may be possible. So right, sometimes advanced students can be addressed. And like I grew up right outside DC. This is a very homogenous community in a political sense, especially in like AP classes. But I think that this could have worked, if the data existed 20 years ago, and if the teacher tried to teach it, even in a situation like that.
One thing that I've had some success with in the classroom is, Pew, which you mentioned earlier, has what they call their political topology, and a quiz that places you into one of, I think it's probably 8 groups: 4 Democratic, 4 Republican, based on your answers to a bunch of issue questions. And it's interesting because it's probably the first time students have thought about a lot of these issues. So there's sort of a teachable moment there that, the things we think about in our everyday lives or about where we live are not the things people think about in other places. But what it also does is Pew's been giving this topology test for decades. So there's this incredibly rich database of what people in the rest of the state, in urban areas, on the coasts, and you can slice and dice it however you want. And I found that to be a real eye-opening thing, that people realize, well, wait a minute, there are other people who agree with me, but there's a lot of people who have different ideas, and we agree on this thing, but not that thing. And that's a you're right. We do have ideological sorting has, partisan and ideological sorting has happened.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of times we do have relatively homogenous high school classes. I think at big state universities, you see variation simply because they're so large. But if we think about the transition from high school to college, um, if they do go to out of state or to a big state university, they're going to see that, and it's important, I think, to cue them up from the beginning. Say, well, wow, this is what the rest of the world looks like. It also explains, honestly, why I think it's easy to jump from living in a homogenous community to thinking that your community's beliefs must be the majority opinion, and to find out no, that's not actually so is a pretty powerful insight.
So I do want to add, and Amanda asked this, and we actually worked in the same school district. So those political typology activities, teachers are actually getting in trouble with parents for giving those. I know that when I taught, I had students take the test. I never asked them what they're like, it was more for them. Um, but I know that in the district that I live in, that I used to work in, they're considered surveys and they have to be approved. And a lot of veteran teachers, Amanda has written this, a lot of veteran teachers just don't do it anymore because they don't want to lose their job. We actually had a school in our district be tweeted by one of the presidential sons, saying that, this person is teaching something that they're not. It's something that, teachers have been using. So Amanda wants to know, do you guys have any opinions on this? Because this is the kind of shift we're seeing from parents, is because they think, well, they are, trying to socialize my child into being, a Democrat or a Republican. Do you have any
That's a hard one.
thoughts? I know.
I have a lot of sympathy. I no one in the Indiana apparat has ever told me what I needed to do or expressed an opinion one way or another, and for that I feel very lucky. I think there might be a slight difference. I'm not so sure, James. Maybe you know this better than I do. Pew is regarded as fairly reputable by most people. Is that fair?
I think so, but I also think that places like Pew and Gallup could easily be lumped in, with some kind of, mainstream media. I think it's very
Sure.
much a long-standing institution, probably in terms of the people who work there, center left, right? Like, there's probably gonna be more Democrats who work at a place like Pew than Republicans, I would assume. It's not guaranteed, but I would tend to start with that. I mean, and you can go on. I can talk a little bit more about that.
All I'm thinking is we clearly have to pick our surveys and pick our spots. And I don't um, I wouldn't criticize anybody who chooses to keep their head down, because nobody wants to be on the front page of the Washington Post. That is no fun. Um, I have some intuition, which I can't for a data guy, I can't give you data on this, but I think we might be on the downslope of those sorts of criticisms, because people have come to realize that it's performative. But those are real concerns, and I don't want to discount them. Maybe people teaching in high schools are on the front lines of civics education, and it is not always a pretty place.
Yeah. So with that, well, Bill was talking about Pew's typology. I'm familiar. Again, bring up a group called More in Common. I know it kind of sounds like more like us, but we know each other very well. They actually introduced me to my first co-founder. So, right, like everything's cool, even if we have a kind of similar name. Uh, and they have something called hidden tribes. In this case, they developed 7 categories. And I don't necessarily recommend, I mean, at least for my goal of reducing fear and loathing of the other party, I don't think that giving students the quiz themselves is going to help do that. I mean, it might be interesting, but it doesn't really achieve my goals. So it's not to say don't do it, but it doesn't really advance it. So I wouldn't include it in any lesson plan that I have, because I don't think it achieves the outcomes that I'm looking for. But I think looking at the results of Hidden Tribes can be very insightful, because what Hidden Tribes shows is that, so it breaks the the American public into 7 categories, and the wings. There's also a term called exhausted majority, which is a little confusing because that's not exactly the wings, but I focus on the wings. The wings are in 2018, we're only 14% of the population. There's something like 8% or so progressive activists and 6% devoted conservatives. But these people, not to other, but right, these 2 groups tend to be the most socioeconomic, the highest in terms of socioeconomic status. They tend to be the loudest, and they often tend to be the whitest. And so this kind of unusual combination is that these 14% of the population are kind of like the classic people you would expect to find on X, Twitter, right? Like they know what's right, and they will just hammer it home. And they often have positions of influence in certain kind of media companies and whatnot. So saying, are we really seeing what the full population is thinking? This 86%, in many cases, there are a lot of people who are kind of disengaged. There's categories where people don't even have, real political belief, clear political beliefs, right or left. They're just not really participating. And then others who are just kind of somewhat moderate, but do lean to a side. But clearly this 14% is disproportionately weighted in terms of what we hear in kind of the quote unquote national conversation, and the incentives push them to be even louder than they would have been in the past.
Yeah, this is the old Twitter is not public opinion problem. Yeah.
So we did, we all met earlier today to kind of chat, and both of you said things that I want to make sure that our listeners get to hear, because I thought that they were really insightful. So Bill, I'm going to start with you. One of the things you said this morning was extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I wrote that down. I put stars by it because we were talking about vetting sources. Can you speak a little bit more to that? Because I think that it just fits really well in our conversation. And I just really loved that when you said it this morning.
Well, it's actually written. That's actually Carl Sagan's quote, and it was he said it when there was some evidence of extraterrestrial life on Mars, and it's he said, look, that would be an amazing thing, but we really need some hard evidence before we start believing that it can't just be, well, it kind of looks that way. You have to sort of show, well, there's a lot of other things going on. We just worked on some briefs on climate change, and we're still working on them. And one of the things that I spent a lot of time getting the research team to think about was, when people talk about climate scientists and they say, well, they have a model, and the rap is, well, all models are wrong. Well, yes. I was trained as a econometrician, and all models are wrong, and but some are useful. And so when we wrote that, it's okay. So this is a pretty for a climate scientist to say, okay, we think temperatures are increasing, and we think the culprit is human-produced greenhouse gases. Why do we believe that? That's a very profound claim, that temperatures in the world have, moved up and down over time so much. And how do we think that humans, who are a very small fraction of the biosphere, could be having this effect? It's an extraordinary claim. Well, we sort of walked through in the brief. This is why we believe those models. This is why scientists, they're not sort of casually making this inference. They've considered other hypotheses, like, is the sun a little warmer, or other explanations, and this is their conclusion is the one that survives this inquiry, and it is extraordinary evidence. That's why we believe it, or why the consensus is that this is what's going on. Now, we're not saying, everybody should bow down to climate scientists, but there is a very deep body of evidence, and it is not casually dismissible. So when issues come up, when people say, well, I think Twitter does some very strange things, that President Biden is, past his prime and being propped up by a strong staff, or Donald Trump is actually a stealth Russian agent, or the Soros Foundation is driving election returns. These are very extraordinary claims, and the common thread in all of them is that the evidence is pretty weak beer. And that's a way of thinking about it, that because there is a claim that might fit a fact or two, we don't believe it, that there are rules of evidence that underlie social science research, and should also underlie how we think about politics, how we think about policy.
I love that. I'm going to make that poster for my husband's classroom. So anytime students do that, though, he can say, "Where's your evidence?"
Well, you'll recall during the various court cases after the 2020 election, I believe it was Rudy Giuliani who said, well, we have a really good theory, but we don't have any evidence. And Rudy's kind of a good poster child, like, okay, then why do we believe it? Admission control at Houston, NASA, they have a big sign up, and it says, "In God we trust, all others bring data." And I think that's a good way to talk about politics.
I love that. James, this morning when we were talking, we were talking about the perception gap, but we were also talking about how a larger perception gap can kind of change voter turnout. And I wanted to make sure that made it in here because I thought it was such an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah. Right. Oh, so hopefully when I say this, you don't be like, oh, I'm not going to talk about the perception gap anymore. I can't risk it. But so since we talked, I did look at some data, not feelings, since I haven't been around for 120 years. But so turnout, and so turnout in the 2020 election, I think, was the highest since. Okay, I mean, essentially the turnout in the 2018 midterms and the turnout in the 2020 presidential election were the highest in roughly 100 years. I think one was, highest since 1900. The other, I think, was the highest since 1914, which I guess would have been midterm. But like, really high turnout, which in general we would think is a good thing, right? That's what I've been drummed into my head, right? Go vote. We need to get more people to vote, and I believe that. However, in this case, a lot of it is probably driven by a term called negative partisanship, or it's sometimes described with the term negative partisanship. But this negative attitudes toward the other party, this sense we must prevent them from having power, not necessarily liking our party all that much, but strongly disliking or being fearful or loathing the other party, and voting out of this fear, out of this contempt. But what am I trying to do? I am trying to lessen the fear and the loathing. I am trying to reduce or counter this negative partisanship. And hopefully there be positive partisanship, that people actually like what they're voting for rather than just voting against things. But it does mean that there is the potential that turnout gets reduced, or maybe one wants to couple doing the perception gap with a lot of, get out the vote, kind of, doing kind of civically active, civic engagement type activities that may increase turnout in a positive way, because on its own, it might kind of sap some of the energy from voting for for these, fear and loathing, negative partisanship reasons.
I was like, when you said that, I'm like, I want to like do more research on that, because are people voting just because they don't like things, as opposed to, no, I actually really like this law or this person, so I want to make sure they get in. So thank you guys for expounding on those two things. So I would really, we're 4 minutes till the hour. I'd really like to thank everyone for attending. But before we leave, I do want to let our panelists talk a little bit more about their resources they have. And if you are listening to this later, this will be on the Arizona Civics podcast. We're going to drop it on March 25th. And you can find the podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts, or on civics.asu.edu. But again, before we leave, Bill, will you kind of talk about what kind of resources you have at Policy and Politics and how educators can use them?
Sure. So the core of what we do are policy briefs, which are 1,200 or so word summaries of different topics. Sometimes we have related groups that related briefs that deal with different aspects of an issue. So in the case of climate, probably we're going to wind up writing about 10 briefs or so. And the mission of Policy versus Politics is to deliver this content to be ruthlessly nonpartisan and ruthlessly non-ideological. And they put somebody like me who's not a politically active in any sense to run it. Sort of tells you what they're trying to do. Also, we write at Policy versus Politics. We write for the high school classroom. We write for average adults. We are aiming at writing things that are aimed at a 10th or 11th grade reading level, because we don't want to write for people who are experts. We want to write for people who don't know a lot. What we also have are, for each one of the policy briefs, we have some now and we're developing more as we go. We have multiple choice questions, in-class exercises, slides to present the information, instructor goals, and right now it's aligned to AP classes. But what we're exploring now is getting it out into civics classes, non-AP American government classes, and we're actively recruiting teachers. So if anyone out there listening to the podcast is interested, check out the Policy versus Politics website and get in contact with us, get in contact with me, and we'll show you what we got. We'd happy to deliver content to anyone who wants it.
And that is, if you're on the webinar, there is links. If you're listening to the podcast, those links will be in our show notes. And then, James, what about More Like Us?
Okay, well, great. So I will talk about what we have right now. Go to the website. I'm sure it'll pop up very soon. It's morelikeus.org. There's a resources and opportunities page. So at the moment, we have a lesson plan about the perception gap for a single class period. And we also have an application to be part of the first cohort to test this. And the deadline for that is March 31st. I realize you might be listening to this after March 31st. That's fine. Just get in contact with me, James at morelikeus.org, or info@morelikeus.org. And sure, happy to work with you and test the efficacy of this. Also, at the moment, we have a Word document, a long list of resources that have been data that's been collected so far about different aspects of the perception gap. So if people want to find examples of the perception gap, they can. But fairly soon, there will be some other resources. One is called the Similarity Hub. It's a one-stop shop to see overlaps between Republicans and Democrats across the political spectrum, or questions on which supermajority, 70% of Americans agree. And it covers immigration and reproductive rights and about 20 other topics. And we are doing this in conjunction with a group called All Sides, and allsides.com. So it'll be hosted on their site, and we're providing a lot of data for that. And also CAST, the framework that I mentioned before, complexity, admiration, similarity, and togetherness, as a way to develop or edit content that hopefully can improve emotions, attitudes, perceptions of those who tend to vote differently. That should be on the website, toward the end of this month or sometime next month.
Fantastic. And again, the one thing that we do love about these resources, all three of our organizations are nonpartisan, and we all love teachers. So again, if you're listening to the podcast, all of this information will be in the show notes. James, Bill, thank you so much for being panelists. Kareen, thank you for your help. And we wish everyone out there, especially those who joined us, a happy Civic Learning Week. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Just wanted to give a heads up that you can find the Center for American Civics on all social media channels as ASU Civics. We love connecting with our community and sharing our thoughts on the issues that matter to us. So if you're interested in our content or just want to say hi, don't hesitate to give us a follow. Plus, we always include any relevant links in our podcast show notes, so be sure to check those out too. Thanks for being a part of our journey.